Washington, D.C., the heart of the United States, is known for its hustle and bustle. But tonight, a thick fog has settled over the city. The usual hum of activity is quieter than usual, and the towering monuments stand shrouded in a ghostly mist. It is as though the city itself is holding its breath. Inside the White House, however, there is no silence. The halls are alive with whispers, urgent phone calls, and quick footsteps. The atmosphere is tense, as if the very air is charged with anticipation. The White House, the symbol of American power and decision-making, is at the center of a storm. At the heart of this chaos stands Pam Bondi, the president's top legal advisor. Known for her sharp instincts and no-nonsense approach, Pam has always thrived in high-pressure situations. But tonight, the stakes are higher than ever. A federal judge, Nathan Kazem, has just overruled President Trump's executive order to freeze $2 billion in foreign aid. The ruling has set off a political and legal firestorm, with critics calling it a dangerous overreach by the judiciary. The president is under fire, and the media has begun questioning his every move. This is not just a legal battle, it is a battle for power. A battle that will determine how much control the judiciary should have over the executive branch. As the clock ticks, the weight of the situation sinks in. Pam understands the gravity of the moment. The ruling does not just challenge a presidential order. It challenges the very balance of power in the government. If the judiciary can overrule executive decisions like this, what does that mean for the future of the country? The question is not just legal. It is deeply personal for every citizen who believes in the integrity of the system. What happens when those who are supposed to protect the law start making decisions that seem out of touch with the people's will? It's a question that resonates with anyone who has ever felt powerless or unheard in the face of authority. Pam's task is clear. She must protect the president's decision, not just in the courts, but in the court of public opinion. She is no stranger to tough battles, and she knows that this fight will be won for the history books. She is a woman of integrity, a fierce advocate for the Constitution, and she will not back down. Her resolve is unshakable, and she understands that this case is more than just a legal issue. It is a fight for the future of the country. Pam Bondi is ready to take on the challenge, and she won't rest until justice is served. Pam Bondi sat in her office, the weight of the news hanging heavily in the air. The phone call had come in just minutes ago. A simple statement from one of her colleagues. Judge Nathan Kazem had overruled President Trump's executive order to freeze $2 billion in foreign aid. The news hit like a punch to the gut. For a brief moment, Pam felt disbelief wash over her. It was hard to imagine that one man, a judge who had only been in power for a short time, could undo what the president had carefully planned. But Pam knew better than to let emotions take over. She quickly snapped herself back into focus, knowing that the stakes were higher than a single court ruling. This was not just about a judge making a decision. This was about the integrity of the executive branch. The balance of power in Washington was at risk. The president's authority had been challenged, and if this ruling went unchallenged, it would send a message that the judiciary could override the executive branch's decisions whenever it wanted. The foundation of the American government, built on a delicate balance of power, was under threat. Pam understood this on a deeply personal level. As a legal advisor, it was her responsibility to protect the Constitution, to ensure that no branch of government overstepped its bounds. She could not let this stand. Her first reaction, like anyone who faces a major setback, was a mixture of disbelief and resolve. The news was jarring, but it also fueled her determination. This was a battle worth fighting, and she would not back down. Pam had faced difficult situations before, but nothing quite like this. The pressure was immense, but she was used to high stakes. The same drive that had carried her through years of legal battles was now pushing her forward, compelling her to act quickly. This was not just about winning a case. It was about protecting the power of the president, the office, and the people who had elected him. Pam wasted no time. She knew that the clock was ticking, and every second counted. She quickly called in her team, assembling the best legal minds in the room. There was no time for hesitation or second-guessing. The appeal had to be drafted, and it had to be drafted fast. Pam was no stranger to the process of appeals, but this case was different. It wasn't just about the legal arguments. It was about framing the issue for the public. The legal fight would take place in court, but the battle for public opinion would unfold in the media. Pam's strategy was clear. She needed to control the narrative. The public perception of this case could shape the way the courts viewed it. If she allowed the media to define the issue, she risked losing the support of the American people. That would be a disaster. Pam knew that public opinion had a powerful influence on legal decisions. A judge may sit in a courtroom, but it was the public that held the power to sway the judge's decisions. It wasn't just about the law. It was about who had the ear of the American people. She turned to the television networks, knowing that her presence on national TV could make a difference. She needed to explain the stakes in simple terms, so the average American could understand. She appeared on a number of talk shows, interviews with reporters who asked her to explain the constitutional crisis at hand. Pam's message was clear. This isn't about politics. It's about who gets to decide the future of our country. She spoke directly to the people, trying to rally their support. This wasn't just an issue for the political elite or Washington insiders. This was an issue for every American who cared about the future of their government. She knew that if she could connect with the everyday citizen, she could win the battle outside the courtroom. The media frenzy that followed was intense. Critics and supporters alike were watching every move. Pam was aware of the scrutiny, but she kept her focus. She refused to let the pressure cloud her judgment. As much as she needed the public support, she also needed to remain calm and collected, sticking to the facts. This was a legal battle, and she would win it with the strength of her arguments, not the strength of her rhetoric. But still, the emotional pull of rallying the public was powerful. She understood that people wanted to feel heard. They wanted to know that their voice mattered. Pam's appearances were not just about defending the president's decision. They were about reminding the people that their government should work for them. Pam's first showdown with Judge Kazem came in the courtroom. It was a tense moment, and the room was packed. The judge sat at the bench, calm and composed, while Pam stood at the podium, her heart steady despite the pressure. The arguments were about to begin, and Pam knew that she had to be sharp. This was where the battle would be fought, on the legal front. Kazem, a progressive judge, had framed his decision as a moral one, arguing that freezing foreign aid would harm vulnerable populations around the world. Pam knew she had to challenge that reasoning head-on. She started with the Constitution, as she always did. The law was on her side, and she would not let Kazem's emotional arguments cloud the constitutional principles that had built the country. "This is not about morality," she said, her voice steady and firm. "This is about the power of the executive branch to make decisions on foreign policy. The president has the authority to determine how our foreign aid is distributed, and that authority cannot be undermined by a single judge." She went on to explain that the executive had the discretion to pause foreign aid, especially in times of national security concerns. It was a power granted to the president by the Constitution, and it could not be overridden by one individual, no matter how well-meaning his intentions were. Kazem's arguments were rooted in his belief that the aid freeze would violate the moral obligation of the United States to help its allies. But Pam, ever the strategist, knew how to counter that argument. She pointed out the real-world implications of unchecked foreign aid. We have veterans on the streets, families struggling to put food on the table, and the government is expected to prioritize global issues over domestic ones? Pam's words hung in the air. She wasn't just defending a policy. She was defending the American people's right to have their needs met first. The room fell silent. It was a moment of truth. Pam wasn't just arguing for a legal ruling. She was arguing for the principle that government should serve the people who elect it. The judge, as powerful as he was in his courtroom, was not the one who should decide the fate of foreign aid policy. Pam's argument was clear, simple, and rooted in the Constitution. The emotional and moral pull of the case could be powerful, but Pam was determined to keep the focus on the law. The battle in the courtroom was only beginning. Pam knew that this fight would not be easily won. She had to remain calm, focused, and strategic, just as she had in her media appearances. But this was the moment she had been preparing for. The stakes were high, and she wasn't about to let the judiciary rewrite the balance of power in the United States. This was a fight for the Constitution, and Pam Bondi was ready to win it. Pam Bondi stood in front of a massive stack of legal documents, her mind racing as the clock ticked down. The case that had started as a courtroom battle was now at the highest level, the Supreme Court of the United States. The stakes couldn't be higher. This wasn't just about one case or one judge. This was about something much bigger, the very framework of the American political system. The media had already made this a high-profile case. With every passing hour, the scrutiny increased. The public was divided, the pressure mounting with each passing minute. And Pam, the woman tasked with defending the Constitution, had to step up and make her final argument. At this moment, everything Pam had worked for in her career had led to this point. She had faced many difficult decisions, but none of them had been quite like this. The media war had intensified, and the eyes of the country were on her. The public was watching closely, not just to see how she would argue the case, but to see how it would affect their own lives. The fate of the president's executive order on foreign aid hung in the balance. If the Supreme Court ruled against them, it would set a precedent that would shift the power in Washington forever. If they won, it would solidify the authority of the executive branch and send a message to the judiciary that their role was to interpret the law, not make policy. In a sense, Pam was standing at the crossroads of history, with the weight of the nation on her shoulders. But in true Pam Bondi fashion, she was calm, collected, and focused. She knew this moment was critical. The public wasn't just watching the legal arguments, they were watching her. Pam was used to being in the spotlight, but this was different. This was a fight for the Constitution, a fight for the very system that had been built to protect the people. And Pam was determined to make sure that system stood firm. As the Supreme Court deliberated, the media circus was in full swing. The airwaves were filled with pundits, analysts, and reporters dissecting every move in the case. On one side, Pam was portrayed as the defender of executive power, standing up for the president's authority. On the other side, Judge Kazem was painted as the defender of justice, trying to preserve the integrity of the law. The two of them had become the faces of the battle, the symbols of the larger struggle over the future of the government. The media frenzy grew louder and louder with each passing day, and the pressure on Pam intensified. She knew the game wasn't just about what happened in the courtroom anymore. It was about shaping public opinion. The media had a way of distorting the facts, and Pam was not going to let that happen. She had to get her message across, to remind the public that this case was not just about politics. It was about the rule of law. As Pam took to the airwaves, she delivered her message with precision, calmness, and conviction. "This is not about one decision," she said in one of her interviews. "This is about the future of our country. It's about who gets to decide what happens in Washington, unelected judges, or the people who elected the president. The people chose the president to lead this country, and it's his responsibility to make decisions on foreign policy, not a judge who was appointed to interpret the law, not make it." Her words resonated with many people across the country. While some in the media tried to spin the case as a power grab by the executive branch, Pam's message cut through the noise. She spoke directly to the American people, reminding them that the Constitution had always been a document that protected the people's right to choose their leaders. Pam wasn't just defending the president. She was defending the democratic system that allowed citizens to have a say in how their country was run. But as the case reached its final moments, the pressure only increased. The court deliberations were taking longer than expected, and the media was eating up every detail. Pam's every move was analyzed. The stress of the situation was palpable. She had been through tough battles before, but this was different. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. This was about how the government functioned and who held the power. The moment of truth finally arrived. The decision came down from the Supreme Court. The court ruled in favor of Pam and the president, upholding the executive order and reinforcing the authority of the executive branch. The relief in Pam's chest was immediate. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight lift off her shoulders. They had won, but the victory wasn't as simple as it seemed. This decision had changed everything. The balance of power in Washington had been tested, and now it had been reaffirmed. The court had made it clear that the executive branch had the constitutional authority to make decisions on foreign policy, and that the judiciary's role was to interpret the law, not rewrite it. Pam's victory was bittersweet. While the immediate pressure had been relieved, the ramifications of the decision would be felt for years to come. This case had opened the door for more challenges to judicial overreach, and Pam knew this was just the beginning. The fight to preserve the balance of power was far from over. But for that moment, Pam allowed herself a quiet smile. She had done it. She had defended the president's decision and, in doing so, had secured the future of the country's democratic system. For Pam, the victory wasn't just about winning a case. It was about proving that the system worked, that the Constitution held up under pressure, and that the rule of law could withstand even the most intense challenges. It was a win not just for the president, but for the American people, who had entrusted their leaders with the power to make decisions on their behalf. Pam's work was far from over. As the media continued to buzz with reactions to the decision, Pam remained focused on the next steps. She knew that this case had set a precedent, and that it would have ripple effects across the political landscape. But in that moment, she allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of a hard-fought battle won. It wasn't just about the legal victory. It was about restoring faith in the system, about showing the American people that their voices still mattered. Victory like this didn't come easily, but Pam knew that it was worth every moment of the struggle. As she stood in front of the cameras, answering questions from reporters, she knew that this case would be studied for years to come. She wasn't just defending a policy. She was defending the future of American democracy. The media frenzy that followed the ruling was intense, with commentators on both sides weighing in. Some praised the decision, calling it a victory for the Constitution, while others decried it as a step toward unchecked executive power. But Pam knew that her fight wasn't over. The battle for the future of the country was ongoing, and she would continue to fight to ensure that the Constitution remained the guiding force in Washington. The ruling had been a win, but Pam understood that the war was far from over. New challenges would arise, and the battle for the balance of power would continue. But for now, the victory was hers. The president's executive order had been upheld, and the American people had seen a powerful example of how their democracy worked. Pam's victory in the Supreme Court was a reminder that the system worked, that checks and balances still mattered. It was a victory for everyone who believed in the rule of law and the idea that justice should be fair and accountable. Pam had taken on the toughest challenge of her career and emerged victorious, not just for the president, but for every American citizen who believed in the strength of their democracy. The dust had not yet settled after Pam Bondi's victorious Supreme Court battle, but the consequences of the decision were already being felt across Washington and the nation. In the weeks following the ruling, the political landscape shifted dramatically. The court's decision had reaffirmed the president's authority over foreign policy, solidifying the executive branch's power to make decisions on foreign aid and other key national issues. However, the true fallout from this case was not only legal, it was political. Pam's strategy had far-reaching implications, and the ripples were spreading far beyond the walls of the White House. As the media continued to cover the aftermath, it became clear that Pam's actions had fundamentally altered the balance of power in Washington. The idea that the executive could act without being restrained by the judiciary was gaining traction. Legislators who had previously been quiet began to speak out in support of the president's authority, emboldened by the court's decision. The political tide had turned in the president's favor, but it wasn't just the politicians who were affected. The American people were watching, and they were beginning to understand the real significance of what had just happened. For the first time in a long while, ordinary citizens felt like they had a voice in the direction their government was headed. The case had brought attention to the power struggle between the branches of government, but it had also sparked something deeper, a conversation about who should hold power and how that power should be used. Pam's fight wasn't just about winning a legal case. It was about ensuring that the system worked for the people. In the aftermath of the ruling, many felt that the government had been reminded of its purpose, to serve the citizens, not just the elites in Washington. People from all walks of life found themselves feeling heard, empowered, and hopeful that their voices mattered in the grand scheme of things. Pam's actions had not only restored the power of the presidency, but had also reshaped the national conversation about judicial overreach. The strategy of holding judges accountable for their actions gained momentum, and what had started as a legal challenge soon became a national movement. The concept of judicial accountability, which had once seemed like a fringe idea, was now being discussed in political circles, in the media, and even in the halls of Congress. Pam had sparked a fire that could not be easily extinguished, and it was beginning to spread across the country. State legislatures, too, started to look into the idea of judicial reform. Pam's victory in the Supreme Court had changed the way the nation viewed the judiciary, and this shift was the foundation for long-term changes in how the courts operated. But despite all the attention and praise, Pam remained focused on the task at hand. She had not set out to become a symbol of change. She had not fought this battle for personal gain or fame. Her mission had always been clear: to restore accountability and transparency to the system. Throughout the media frenzy and the whirlwind of interviews, Pam had stayed true to her values. She knew that this was just the beginning. The real work of reforming the judiciary, ensuring that judges didn't wield unchecked power, was still ahead. But in those quiet moments, as she sat in her office reviewing the next steps, Pam allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She had done what she set out to do. She had won the battle for the executive's authority and had, in the process, reignited a conversation about the very nature of democracy and the rule of law. Pam's transformation from a legal advisor to a symbol of change was not something that happened overnight. It was a gradual process, shaped by her commitment to the Constitution and her unwavering belief that the law should be fair and balanced. As her reputation grew, so did the expectations placed on her. People looked to her not just as a lawyer, but as someone who had taken on the toughest challenge of her career and emerged victorious. She had become the face of judicial reform, the one person who had stood up to the judiciary and shown that no branch of government was above the law. Yet, despite her growing influence and the national spotlight, Pam remained grounded. She never sought the fame or accolades that came with her success. She had a mission, and that mission was far from complete. The people who had supported her throughout the battle for judicial accountability were not the ones she sought to impress. Instead, she focused on the broader implications of her actions. What did this victory mean for the future of the country? How could she ensure that the system of checks and balances remained intact for future generations? These were the questions that drove her, not the praise or the media attention. Pam understood that true change was not about personal recognition. It was about doing what was right for the country, even when it was hard. Pam's humility in the face of success was one of the most striking aspects of her character. Despite the media frenzy and the accolades that followed her victory, she remained focused on the work that lay ahead. She knew that judicial overreach was not an isolated problem. It was a systemic issue that needed to be addressed in a comprehensive way. Her victory had been a major step forward, but there was much more to be done. Pam had always been driven by the idea that the law was a tool to serve the people, and she wasn't about to let that mission be distracted by external forces. She had fought for fairness and accountability, and she would continue to do so, even as the political landscape shifted around her. In the months following the Supreme Court decision, Pam's influence continued to grow. As she traveled across the country, speaking at events and meeting with lawmakers, she saw firsthand how her actions had inspired others. People were beginning to ask questions about the power of the judiciary and whether it was time for real reform. State legislatures began introducing bills aimed at increasing judicial accountability, and citizens from all walks of life voiced their support for the movement Pam had started. It was a powerful moment in American politics, one that would change the course of history. Despite the political and legal victories, Pam knew that her work was not done. The fight to protect the balance of power in Washington, to ensure that the executive branch could make decisions without fear of judicial interference, was an ongoing battle. But Pam had learned something important through the course of this struggle. There was always room for improvement. She understood that even the most well-designed systems could be improved upon, and she was committed to ensuring that the checks and balances that defined American democracy were upheld for years to come. As the final chapters of this legal and political saga began to close, Pam stood at the center of it all, knowing that she had made a lasting impact. The road ahead would not be easy, and she understood that challenges would continue to arise. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful for the future. The American people had been reminded that their voices mattered, that their government was still a system of checks and balances. Pam had restored that vital principle, and in doing so, she had not only defended the Constitution, she had reminded the country of the power of standing up for what is right, even when it seems like the odds are stacked against you. Pam Bondi had faced a formidable opponent, fought a fierce battle, and emerged victorious. But more importantly, she had reminded the country that true leadership comes not from the powerful, but from those who stand up for the values that protect and serve the people. Her legacy would live on in the legal reforms that followed, in the principles she championed, and in the countless people who found inspiration in her courage and resolve. In the end, Pam had not only fought for the future of her country, she had reshaped it,